I was the only man in England who dared laugh at Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscar, and I very nearly lost that privilege the evening. He asked his own ward to marry him and called it a favor. "You want her to pretend," I said, setting down my glass before I dropped it. "You want Margaret Vane, who has darned your cousin's stockings and catalogued your library and gone 8 years without a new gown that wasn't cut down from someone else's, to stand up in front of the whole of London and pretend to be in love with you." "Not in love," Julian said, staring into the fire as though it owed him an explanation. "Merely engaged. There is a difference, Harry, and you know it." I did know it, and I knew Julian well enough. We had been at Eton together, at Oxford together, and in the years since he'd become the hollow Duke of Ravenscar, we had remained close enough that he trusted me with the truth he showed no one else. The truth, that evening, was that his cousin Reginald Ashworth Price, heir presumptive to a dukedom that had no closer heir, had delivered an ultimatum dressed as brotherly concern. Marry within the season, or Reginald would go before the trustees of the estate, men loyal to the name more than the man, and argue that a duke who could not secure the succession could not be trusted to manage the estate's finances either. It was blackmail wearing a cravat, and worse, Reginald had already produced the bride, a Miss Cordelia Fenwick, daughter of a family friend with debts deep enough to drown in, pleasant and poor in judgment, who would make Julian miserable within a 12-month and hand Reginald the run of Ravenscar's ledgers within 2. "So instead of marrying a fortune hunter your cousin has selected for you," I said, "your solution is to enlist your own ward in a fiction that could ruin her reputation entirely if it is ever discovered." "She would not be ruined. She would be pitied perhaps when the engagement quietly ends. Young women survive being pitied. They do not survive marrying men who despise them, which is what would happen if I let Reginald choose my wife." He turned from the fire, and for a moment the hollowness that had earned him his name, the ice that had settled over him since Arabella Winthrop broke their engagement 6 years before and married a viscount for his rents, cracked just enough for me to see the man beneath it, tired and cornered. "Margaret wants nothing from me, Harry. That is the whole of my reasoning. She has lived at Ravenscar's edges for 8 years and asked for nothing beyond a roof and a task to occupy her hands. She will not mistake this for real. She will not be wounded when it ends." I did not believe that last part, even then. I had watched Margaret Vane cross a room. I had seen the particular, careful stillness she wore like armor, the stillness of a woman who had learned very young that wanting things allowed only invited other people to take them away. But I said nothing, because Julian had already risen to summon her, and some things a man must learn for himself. Margaret came into the study still wearing her spectacles, a ledger under her arm, as though she expected to be asked about the household accounts and not about the shape of her whole future. "Your Grace," she said, and then seeing me inclined her head. "Mr. Sinclair." "Sit, Margaret," Julian said, and there was something almost apologetic in it, which told me he knew exactly how much he was asking. She sat. She listened to the whole of it, Reginald's scheme, the trustees, Miss Fenwick, the wedding season stretching before them like a battlefield, without once interrupting, her hands folded over the ledger in her lap. When Julian finished, laying out his proposal with the flat, careful language of a man presenting a business contract, Margaret was quiet long enough that I began to wonder if she meant to refuse him outright, which I confess I half hoped she would. "You want me to pose as your intended," she said finally, "so that your cousin cannot force you toward a match that would harm you, and so that the trustees have no cause to interfere in matters that are yours by right." "Yes, for the length of the season. And then it ends quietly, and I return to the ledgers, and you remain unmarried and unbothered until you choose otherwise." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment, and I saw something move behind her eyes that was not quite hope and not quite hurt, but some complicated cousin of both. "And what do I gain from it, Your Grace, beyond the inconvenience?" It was the plainest question I had ever heard asked of a duke, and I liked her enormously for it. Julian did not flinch. A settlement, whatever the outcome, enough that you need never again wonder whether you are a burden on this family. A choice, when it ends, of where you live and how, independent of anyone's charity. And my word that no harm will come to you in the doing of it, so far as it is in my power to prevent. Margaret considered this with the same unhurried care she brought to a column of figures that would not balance. "I will want it in writing," she said. "Not because I doubt your word, your grace, but because I have learned that promises made in fire-lit rooms are easily forgotten by daylight." "Fair," Julian said, and something in his voice had gone warm, though I doubt he noticed it himself. "And I will want boundaries agreed upon now, so there is no confusion later. We are business partners in this, nothing more. I will not be made a fool of, and I will not pretend affection I do not feel merely because an audience is watching, beyond what the performance requires." "Agreed," Julian said. "Then I accept," said Margaret Vane, and rose, and left the room with her ledger still tucked beneath her arm, as though she had merely settled a dispute about the coal accounts and not agreed to become, in the eyes of all society, the intended bride of the Duke of Ravenscar. I looked at my friend, who was watching the door where she had gone with an expression I had not seen on him in 6 years. "You are in a great deal of trouble, Julian," I said. "Don't be absurd, Harry. I have known you since we were boys throwing stones at Latin masters," I said. "I have never once seen you look at a woman the way you just looked at that door." He told me, with considerable dignity, to go to the devil, and poured himself another brandy, and I let the matter rest for the moment, because I did not yet know how right I was, nor how glad I would eventually be of it. The betrothal was announced within the week, and Ravenscar's dusty halls came suddenly alive with the business of dressmakers, for a duke's intended could not be seen in cut-down gowns. I watched Margaret stand for fittings with composed patience, though I caught her once running her fingers over a bolt of blue silk with something like wonder, quickly suppressed, as though she had caught herself wanting a thing she had no right to want. The first true test came at a country dinner Julian hosted for the neighboring families, ostensibly to introduce his intended before London got hold of the news and mangled it into gossip. Reginald arrived uninvited but unrefusable, trailing Miss Fenwick behind him like a hound on a leash, and I watched the whole performance unfold from a chair near the fire with the guilty pleasure of a man who has paid for a good seat at the theater. "Cousin," Reginald said, taking Margaret's hand with a courtesy so thin I could see the contempt beneath it. "How unexpected! I had thought you occupied with the household accounts, Miss Vane, not with securing a coronet." "I have always found accounts and coronets require the same close attention to detail, Mr. Ashworth Price," Margaret said, drawing her hand back with perfect grace. "One learns not to let a figure slip past unexamined." I nearly choked on my wine. Reginald's smile thinned further, but he had no answer for it, and Julian was watching Margaret with an expression that had nothing to do with performance at all. "You did that beautifully," he murmured to her later, as the guests moved toward the dining room, his hand at the small of her back in the manner expected of an engaged man, though I noticed he kept it there rather longer than strictly required. "I have spent 8 years being condescended to by your relations, your grace," Margaret said. "I have had a great deal of practice absorbing the blow and returning it with interest." "Julian," he said, "if we are to be convincing, you might begin using my name." She glanced up at him, something flickering across her face, surprise, perhaps, that he had asked, rather than commanded. "Julian, then," she said, and I watched my friend's jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with irritation. Dinner itself was a master-class in the particular cruelty of well-bred people. Miss Fenwick's mother, seated beside Margaret, spent the fish course inquiring after her family, with the transparent aim of establishing how very little family Margaret had to speak of. and the soup course establishing how very little fortune attended what family remained. "Your parents, I understand, left you very little," Mrs. Fenwick said, dabbing her mouth with the delicacy of a woman delivering a wound and calling it conversation. "It must be such a relief to you to have found the Duke's charity all these years." "His Grace's guardianship, yes," Margaret said, and I saw her spine straighten a fraction, though her voice never rose. "Though I confess I have never thought of 8 years of honest work managing this household as charity, Mrs. Fenwick. I dare say the estate's accounts would tell a different story than idleness, were you to examine them." "Margaret keeps Ravenscar running more capably than any steward I have employed," Julian said, and there was steel in it now, aimed politely but unmistakably at Mrs. Fenwick's bent head. "I count myself fortunate that circumstance placed so competent a woman under this roof." Mrs. Fenwick had no further appetite for the fish course after that, and I spent the rest of the meal in quiet delight, watching a duke who had been called hollow for 6 years defend a woman who needed considerably less defending than he seemed to think, and watching that woman notice, despite herself, that he had bothered to try. It was on the walk back to the drawing-room that I fell into step beside Margaret, while Julian was detained by his aunt. "You did not need his help, you know," I said. "You had already rooted her twice before he opened his mouth." "I know it," Margaret said, and there was a dry humor in it that I had not expected. "But it was rather nice, Mr. Sinclair, to have someone stand beside me while I did the routing, for once. I have grown accustomed to fighting these particular battles alone." "That is the tragedy of Ravenscar," I said. "Everyone in that family fights alone, out of long practice, when they might do a great deal better fighting together." She looked at me sharply, as though she suspected me of meaning more than I had said, which I had, and then she laughed a real laugh, low and surprised out of her, as though it had escaped before she could catch it. "You are a dangerous man, Mr. Sinclair." "Only an honest one," I said. "It is rarer, and often mistaken for the same thing." Before London claimed them, however, there was a quieter scene at Ravenscar that I have never forgotten, though it involved no audience, no cousin, no trustee, and very little drama at all, only Margaret and the household she had served so faithfully for 8 years, and the particular reckoning she made with her own new position before she ever set foot in a London ballroom. Mrs. Hobbs, the Ravenscar housekeeper, had known Margaret since she arrived at the estate as a girl of 16, grieving and friendless, and it was Mrs. Hobbs I found weeping quietly into a tea towel in the still room the morning the betrothal was announced below stairs. "Forgive me, Mr. Sinclair. It is only that I have watched that girl take her meals in corners and speak only when spoken to for 8 years, as though she believed she had no right to a full portion of anything, and now to see her—" She stopped, pressing the towel to her eyes. "I am glad someone has finally troubled to see what the rest of us saw years ago." I found Margaret herself an hour later, packing the few possessions she meant to bring to London, and I could not resist repeating what Mrs. Hobbs had said, for I thought Margaret ought to hear it. She went very still over the trunk she was filling. "I did not know she felt so," Margaret said quietly. "I have always tried not to make my situation any more visible than it needed to be. I did not want anyone here to think I resented them, or resented my place." "No one thought that of you," I said. "They thought you brave and hardworking and entirely too willing to make yourself smaller than the room required. It is not the same thing as invisibility, Miss Vane, however much you may have wished it were." She was quiet a long moment, folding a shawl with more care than the task strictly demanded. "Do you think it foolish, Mr. Sinclair, that I am frightened? Not of London precisely, nor even of Reginald, but of believing this. Of letting myself want it to be real, when I agreed at the outset that it would not be, and built myself accordingly not to hope for more." "I think," I said, "that you have spent 8 years being sensible in order to survive a house that did not always deserve your sense." I think you are entitled now to be a little unwise, if the alternative is refusing happiness on principle merely because you once agreed it would not come." She looked at me with something like gratitude and something like fear still lingering beneath it, and said nothing further. But I noticed she packed, among the practical woolens and sensible boots, the length of blue silk she had once run her fingers over with such carefully suppressed wonder, as though some small, hopeful part of her had already begun making room for a future she had not yet permitted herself to claim aloud. It was with that image in mind, Margaret folding hope into a trunk beside her wool stockings, not yet ready to name it, but unwilling any longer to leave it behind, that I watched the Brook Street household come alive with the business of the season, and understood that whatever performance she and Julian had agreed to in that firelit study, some quieter, truer thing had already begun taking root beneath it, long before either of them was ready to call it by its name. By the time the wedding season proper began in London, and Julian's townhouse on Brook Street filled with the particular chaos of a duke's household preparing for a season of scrutiny, I had begun to understand that what I was watching was no longer entirely a performance, whatever either of them told themselves. The London ball that would prove the turning point was hosted by the Dowager Countess of Elmsworth, an event so thoroughly attended by every family with a marriageable son or daughter that Julian called it, without exaggeration, the trial by fire. Margaret wore a gown of soft dove-gray silk trimmed in silver, lent, I later learned, from Julian's own aunt, who had taken a sudden and fierce liking to Margaret once she understood how neatly the girl had rooted Mrs. Fenwick, and she stood at the top of the Elmsworth stairs on Julian's arm looking, for the first time in the 8 years I had known her existed, like a woman the world might actually see. "You look as though you have swallowed a very large stone, Julian," I told him, sidling up as Margaret was drawn briefly into conversation with the Countess. "I look perfectly composed," Julian said, in the tone of a man reciting a fact he did not believe. "You look like a man who has just realized the woman on his arm is not merely convenient." I watched his jaw work, watched him not deny it, and pressed my advantage the way old friends are entitled to. "How long have you known?" "Known what?" "Don't be tiresome, Julian." "I have watched you avoid looking directly at her for a fortnight, the way other men avoid looking at the sun." He did not answer, because at that moment Margaret returned to his side, and whatever admission I might have wrung from him dissolved into the practiced motions of the evening. The bow, the offered arm, the murmured word that set her at ease before the crowd's attention could unsettle her. The dancing began, and I watched them take the floor together for the first set, and I will say plainly that I have attended a great many balls in my life, and I have rarely seen two people dance like that, correctly, formally, every step within the bounds of propriety, and yet with an attention between them so total that the rest of the room might have been furniture. Margaret's hand rested in Julian's, light as asked, and his other hand at her waist held the exact correct distance, and yet the space between their faces seemed to me, watching from the edge of the floor, to be narrowing by degrees no chaperone could have measured but any honest observer could see. "She dances beautifully," said a voice at my elbow, and I turned to find Reginald Ashworth Price watching the same scene with an expression considerably less charmed than my own. "She does everything beautifully, in my observation," I said. "It is a quality that seems to have escaped your notice for 8 years, Mr. Ashworth Price, though I understand you are noticing it rather keenly now." "I notice a great many things, Sinclair." His eyes did not leave the dance floor. "I notice that my cousin, who has not looked at a woman with anything resembling warmth since Arabella Winthrop made a fool of him, is looking at his little ward as though she has hung the moon. I find that curious, given that a fortnight ago she was cataloging his library for her bread." "Some men recognize quality slowly," I said. "It does them credit, not discredit, that they arrive at the truth eventually." "Or," Reginald said, and here his voice dropped, confiding and cold, Some men are being very cleverly managed by a woman with nothing to lose and everything to gain from persuading a duke he is in love with her. I wonder which story the trustees would find more compelling, Sinclair, should it ever reach them, a genuine match, or a penniless ward who saw her chance and took it. I felt my temper rise faster than was wise for a man attempting to represent his friend's interests at a ball, and I was on the point of saying something considerably less than diplomatic when the music ended, and Julian and Margaret returned to us, breathless, and, for just a moment, before either remembered themselves, smiling at each other in a way that needed no translation. Reginald saw it too. I watched the calculation shift behind his eyes, watched him understand that whatever he had assumed was pretense might be turning, or had already turned, into something considerably harder to dismantle. "Cousin," he said, bowing over Margaret's hand with a courtesy gone brittle at the edges, "you dance as though you have had a great deal of practice being someone's intended. One wonders where you learned it, given your limited society." "One learns quickly, Mr. Ashworth Price, when the matter at hand requires attention," Margaret said, and there was an edge under the smoothness of it that told me she had understood his meaning exactly. "I find most things are simpler than people wish to believe, provided one is honest about what is actually wanted." "And what is actually wanted here, I wonder," Reginald said, softly enough that only our small circle caught it. "A marriage, or merely the appearance of one, kept up long enough to serve its purpose." Julian's hand found Margaret's where it rested on his arm, and I watched his fingers close over hers, not for the audience now, I think, but because he could not help it. "What is wanted, Reginald?" Julian said, and his voice had dropped into the register I had heard him use exactly twice before in our lives, both times before a genuine threat, "is for you to stop measuring my household by your own hunger for it. Whatever passes between myself and Miss Vane is no longer any business of the trustees, nor of Miss Fenwick's mother, nor of you. I would advise you to enjoy the punch and leave the rest to me." Reginald's smile did not reach his eyes as he withdrew, but I saw, before he turned, a flicker of genuine unease. The recognition of a man who understands his scheme has run aground on something he did not account for, that the fiction he meant to expose as false had become, without anyone quite marking the moment, true. "That was unwise," Margaret said quietly, once Reginald had gone, though she did not remove her hand from Julian's arm. "Perhaps," Julian said, "but I find I no longer much care what is wise where you are concerned, Margaret." She looked up at him, startled, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and I feeling suddenly very much like a man intruding on a conversation not meant for him, excused myself to find the card room, though I confess I did not go very far, and I confess further that what I overheard as I lingered near enough to keep an eye on the pair of them left no doubt in my mind that whatever this arrangement had begun as, it was not what it had become. "You did not need to defend me," Margaret said. "I have managed Reginald's insults for 8 years without your help." "I know it," Julian said. "You manage everything without anyone's help. It is the most maddening thing about you, and the thing I admire most, and I find I would like, very much, to no longer watch you do it alone." I did not hear her answer if she gave one, for the crowd shifted and swallowed the rest, but I saw her hand tighten on his arm, and I saw Julian's face in that unguarded second, the hollowness gone from it entirely, replaced by something so plainly, helplessly tender that I had to look away, out of respect for a private moment happening in the middle of a public ballroom. The days that followed brought no fewer engagements, dinners, morning calls, a trip to the theater that Julian arranged with unusual care, a picnic got up by his aunt that I suspect was designed expressly to throw the two of them together in circumstances less formal than a ballroom. And with each one I watched the practiced ease between them deepen into something that had stopped needing practice at all. The picnic, in particular, I remember with great fondness, for it was the first occasion I saw Margaret entirely unguarded among people who wished her well. Julian's aunt, Lady Effington, had assembled a party at Richmond, ostensibly to admire the river, though she confided to me over the cold chicken that her true purpose was to get the two of them out from under the eyes of London for an afternoon, so they might remember they are people, and not merely a spectacle for the tongue to chew upon. It worked admirably. Margaret, freed for a few hours from the scrutiny of ballrooms and dinner tables, walked the riverbank with her half-boots mudded and her bonnet slipping back on her head, laughing at something Julian's young niece Charlotte had said. The child had attached herself to Margaret within the first quarter hour, with the unerring instinct children have for adults who will actually listen to them. "You are very good with her," Julian said, coming to walk beside Margaret as Charlotte ran ahead to inspect a patch of reeds. "She does not yet know to expect condescension from adults, so she has not learned to guard herself against it," Margaret said. "I confess I find her company restful compared to most of the drawing rooms I have sat in this month." "I have watched you sit in those drawing rooms," Julian said, "and marveled at how little of yourself you allow them to see. It is only out here, away from all of it, that I think I am seeing the whole of you." "And what do you make of the whole of me, Your Grace?" "That I have spent 8 years living under the same roof as the most interesting person in it, and did not trouble to notice until a scheme not of my choosing forced me to look properly." He stopped walking, and so did she, the river sliding past, and Charlotte's delighted shrieking carrying faintly from downstream. "I find that a great waste of 8 years, Margaret, and I find myself unwilling to waste any more of them." I was near enough to hear this, seated with Lady Effington on a blanket a discreet distance off, and I saw her eyebrows climb toward her bonnet in unconcealed delight. "Well," she said, quite satisfied, "I believe my little scheme has borne rather more fruit than I planned for." "You are worse than Reginald," I told her, "only your scheming tends toward happiness rather than ruin." "Someone in this family ought to, Harry," she said. "It has been sorely neglected since poor Julian's disappointment with that Winthrop girl. I do not think I shall need to scheme much further in any case. He has done the rest of the work quite thoroughly himself." She was not wrong. By the time the party turned back toward the carriages, Charlotte had fallen fast asleep against Margaret's shoulder, and Margaret carried her the last quarter-mile without complaint, and Julian watched her do it with an expression so unguarded that I very nearly said something to him about it on the spot. It was at the theater that I first saw Margaret's guard slip entirely. The play was a comedy, forgettable in every particular except that partway through the second act, Julian leaned close to murmur some observation in her ear, and Margaret laughed, not the careful, measured laugh she offered society, but something helpless and delighted, her hand coming up to cover her mouth as though she had surprised herself with it. Julian watched her laugh with an expression of such open wonder that I nearly said something aloud from my own seat 2 rows back, and only the presence of his aunt beside me, who elbowed me sharply and murmured, "Do be quiet, Harry, and let them alone," kept me silent. "He has not smiled like that in 6 years," his aunt told me during the interval, her eyes fixed on her nephew with the particular fierce satisfaction of a woman who has waited a long time to be right about something. "Not since before Arabella. I confess I did not think we should see it again." "Nor did I said and meant it." "And the girl," his aunt went on, lowering her voice further. "Do you know, Harry, I have known Margaret Vane 8 years, and I do not believe I have ever seen her want anything for herself. She has spent her whole life making certain she took up as little room as possible, so that no one should ever have cause to resent her presence. It does my heart good to see her sitting in a box at the theater in a new gown, wanted, for once, rather than merely tolerated." I thought of Julian's words to me the night this had all begun. She will not mistake this for real. She will not be wounded when it ends, and I understood, watching them both across that theater box, how thoroughly my friend had misjudged the situation, and how thoroughly and how happily he was about to be proven wrong. Between the theater and that final crisis, there fell a quieter week that I have always thought of as the true turning point, though it produced no scene fit for society's gossip. It was the week Julian took a fever. Nothing serious, the physician assured us. A chill caught riding home from a late sitting in the Lords, settled in his chest, requiring rest and patience. But Julian, who prided himself on never being any trouble to anyone, made a wretched patient, and it was Margaret, not his valet nor his aunt nor even myself, who took it upon herself to see him through it, arriving each morning with a tray and a book and a firmness that brooked no argument from a duke half delirious with fever and entirely convinced he did not require nursing. "You need not sit with me," Julian told her the second evening, his voice rough with the discomfort of it. "I have servants enough for that, Margaret. I am not troubling myself. I am choosing to sit here, which is an entirely different matter, and one you have no authority to forbid, whatever your rank. Now be still and drink the broth, or I shall read you something considerably duller than the novel I have brought." He drank the broth. I know because I looked in on them both that evening and found Julian, weak and irritable and clearly delighted despite himself, submitting to her care with none of the stubbornness he showed his physician, Margaret reading aloud in a low, even voice that seemed to ease something in him far more effectively than any medicine. "You are very patient with him," I told her quietly in the corridor afterward. "He is not accustomed to being cared for," Margaret said. "I do not think anyone has troubled to nurse him through so much as a head cold since his mother died. He has spent so many years managing everyone else's crises that I do not think it occurred to him he might be permitted one of his own, now and again, without the world collapsing for it. And you do not mind the trouble. I have spent 8 years being useful to this family in ways no one much noticed or thanked me for," she said. "I find I do not mind being useful to him in a way he notices. It is the first time in a great while that being needed has felt like a gift rather than an obligation." By the week's end, Julian was recovered enough to grumble about it, though I noticed he kept, for some weeks after, the novel Margaret had read to him on his nightstand, though he never once admitted to finishing it himself. The crisis came, as crises will, precisely when it was least wanted, a fortnight before the season's close, at a dinner Reginald had engineered with the particular malice of a man who knows his scheme is failing and means to force its collapse before it can fail entirely. He had invited the trustees. I was seated near enough to Julian to see his color change when he understood what Reginald had done. 3 grave, gray men who controlled, in practical terms, whether Julian could act as master of his own estate or merely as its figurehead. All seated at Reginald's table under the pretense of a family dinner, all watching Margaret with the frank, assessing eyes of men deciding whether an investment was sound. "Miss Vane," said the eldest of them, a Mr. Pemberton whose voice had the dry rustle of old paper, "I understand you were raised at Ravenscar under his Grace's guardianship. A curious arrangement to find a ward become an intended bride. One wonders how long this attachment has truly existed, and whether it might not have been encouraged by proximity and by certain practical advantages rather than by genuine feeling." The insinuation was not subtle, and Reginald did not trouble to hide his satisfaction at having engineered the moment. I saw Julian's hand tighten around his wine glass, saw him draw breath to answer, and then saw Margaret set down her own glass with a small, precise click that drew every eye at the table to her instead. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, "I have spent 8 years at Ravenscar being reminded, by one relation or another, that I was an obligation rather than a person, a debt of blood that his Grace's family was honor-bound to pay and nothing more. I accepted that estimation of myself for a great many years, because no one troubled to offer me another. I will not pretend to you now that this began as anything but a practical arrangement, because I think you are too intelligent a man to believe a prettier lie, and I have never had much use for lying in any case." The table had gone entirely silent. Julian was staring at her as though he had never seen her before. "But I will tell you what has become true in the weeks since," Margaret went on, "because I think you deserve the truth more than you deserve my comfort. I have watched His Grace defend a woman who did not ask for defending, simply because he could not bear to see her insulted at his own table. I have watched him listen, actually listen, in a way I had begun to think no one in this family was capable of. I have watched a man everyone in London calls hollow prove, over and over, that he is nothing of the sort. If that is not the beginning of genuine feeling, Mr. Pemberton, I do not know what you imagine genuine feeling to look like." Mr. Pemberton, to his credit, looked faintly abashed. Reginald did not. His face had gone tight and pale with the particular fury of a man watching his last card fail to take the trick. "Pretty words," Reginald said, "from a woman with every reason to speak them, whatever the truth beneath." "Then ask me," Julian said, and every head at the table turned to him instead. He had risen from his chair, and there was nothing hollow in his face at all, nothing guarded, nothing careful, only a plain and rather astonished honesty. "Ask me whether what I feel for Margaret Vane is real, Reginald, since you have gone to such trouble to stage the question in front of witnesses. I asked her to pretend because I had convinced myself, after Arabella, that I was no longer capable of anything else. I was wrong. I have watched this woman face down every insult your family and mine could contrive without once losing her dignity, and I have fallen in love with her so thoroughly that I no longer recognize the man I was before this season began. If that satisfies the trustees' concern, gentlemen, I am glad of it. If it does not, I do not know what further proof I can offer beyond my own word, which has never yet been questioned until my cousin found it inconvenient to his ambitions. I have attended a great many dinners in my life, and I have never sat through a silence quite like the one that followed. Margaret was staring up at Julian with an expression I can only describe as undone. All her careful composure, the armor she had worn so long she had likely forgotten she wore it at all, fallen away entirely, leaving something rower and lovelier beneath. "Julian," she said very quietly, "you did not need to say that in front of the trustees." "I find," Julian said, and his voice had gone unsteady in a way I had genuinely never heard from him, "that I no longer wish to say it anywhere else. I am tired of hollowness, Margaret. I am tired of being called a man made of ice by people who never troubled to look past the surface of me. You have looked at me, truly looked, since the very first evening I asked this impossible thing of you, and I do not intend to spend one more day pretending I do not want, more than I have ever wanted anything, for it to be real." Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat with the discomfort of a man witnessing something considerably more intimate than he had bargained for at a dinner engineered for scandal. "I believe," he said, rising, "that the trustees have no further business here this evening. Your Grace's judgment on this matter, at least, appears entirely sound." He shot a look at Reginald that held no warmth whatsoever. "I would suggest, Mr. Ashworth Price, that future concerns regarding the succession be brought to us through proper channels, and not staged as theater at a family dinner. It reflects poorly on the concern, and rather more poorly on the one raising it." Reginald left before the fish course was cleared, and I do not believe I have ever taken quite so much pleasure in watching a man's scheme collapse around his own ears. But it was not Reginald's humiliation that held my attention as the room emptied, and the trustees took their leave with considerably warmer words for Julian than they had arrived with. It was Margaret, still seated, still staring up at the man who had just declared himself before witnesses she had feared, only hours before, might end this whole arrangement in disgrace. "You meant it," she said, once the room had cleared enough for privacy. "Every word." "Every word," Julian said. He came around the table and knelt, actually knelt, a duke of the realm, in front of the whole remaining company of servants clearing dishes, which I am certain scandalized at least one footman considerably, and took her hand in his. I asked you to pretend because I believed it was the only safe thing left to me, Margaret. I did not account for what it would mean to spend every day for a season in your company, to watch you meet every unkindness this family has ever shown you with more grace than any of us deserved, to realize that the person I trusted most in this world to want nothing from me was, without my noticing, becoming the only person I wanted everything from. I am asking you now in earnest, with no pretense left between us and no boundary required, will you marry me, Margaret? Not as a business arrangement, not for the season, for the whole of my life, however long I am given it. Margaret's eyes had gone bright, and for a moment I thought she might weep, though when she spoke her voice held steady, the same plain, unflinching honesty she had carried through 8 years of being overlooked. I told you that first evening that I would not pretend affection I did not feel, she said. I did not tell you, because I did not yet know it myself, that the affection would not need pretending for very long. I have spent my whole life being an obligation to people who never once asked what I wanted. You asked Julian from the very first night, with your ledger in my lap and my whole future being decided in a single conversation, and you have gone on asking it every day since, in 100 small ways I do not think you even noticed yourself doing. I love you. I did not intend to, and I certainly did not plan to fall in love with the man I was contracted to deceive society alongside. But I have entirely, and I would be gladder than I know how to say, to marry you in truth. I will confess, without shame, that I had to look away for a moment myself, blinking rather more than the smoke of the dining room candles strictly warranted. The wedding took place at Ravenscar itself, at the close of the season, in the small stone chapel that had stood on the estate for 3 centuries and seen, by the vicar's own count, 4 generations of Ashworth brides married within its walls. It was not the grand affair Reginald had once hoped to orchestrate for his own advantage. It was, at Margaret's particular request, small and warm and full only of people who had actually wished them well from the beginning, which excluded Reginald entirely, though Julian's aunt attended in a gown of deep blue, and wept without any embarrassment whatsoever through the entire ceremony. You were right, you know, Julian told me, the morning of the wedding, as I helped him with a cravat he could not, for once in his composed life, manage to tie correctly with his hands trembling as they were. That first evening, you told me I was in a great deal of trouble. I am usually right, I said, though I will allow that I did not expect the trouble to end quite so happily. Nor did I. He caught my eye in the looking-glass, and there was nothing hollow left in his face at all, only a kind of settled, astonished gladness, the expression of a man who had spent 6 years believing himself incapable of this and had been proven, gloriously, wrong. Thank you, Harry, for not laughing me entirely out of that study when I first proposed the scheme. I laughed a fair amount, I said, but I never doubted even then that you had chosen better than you knew. Margaret Vane was always worth choosing, Julian. It only wanted a man clear-sighted enough to see her properly, rather than merely conveniently. He clasped my shoulder and said nothing further, because there was nothing further that needed saying, and together we went down to the small stone chapel where Margaret Vane, no longer a ward no one wanted, no longer an obligation counted and discharged, but a bride chosen, entirely and forever for herself alone, stood waiting in a gown of ivory silk with her chin lifted and her eyes steady, exactly as she had stood in every room I had ever watched her enter. Dignified and unbowed and entirely her own woman, right up until the moment she became, at last, and by her own free choosing, his. I stood as Julian's groomsman that day, and I have stood as friend to the both of them in every year since, and I can report, from a vantage no one else was quite so fortunate to share, that the hollow Duke of Ravenscar was never called hollow again by anyone who had occasion to see him with his wife. Not by society, which soon forgot it had ever coined the epithet, and not by Reginald, who removed himself to the continent within the year and troubled the family very little thereafter. Having found London considerably less comfortable once his scheme had made him, rather than his cousin, the subject of its gossip. What I remember best, though, is not the wedding itself, nor even Julian's declaration at that fateful dinner, but a smaller moment, weeks before, in the Ravenscar library, where it had all begun. Margaret at her ledgers, as she had been for 8 quiet years, and Julian standing in the doorway watching her work with an expression that had nothing guarded left in it at all. "You needn't watch me like that," she had said without looking up, though I caught the small smile she could not quite suppress. "I am only doing the accounts." "I know," Julian had said. "I find I like watching you do them. I find, in fact, that I would like to go on watching you do a great many ordinary things, for a great many ordinary years, if you would permit it." "That," Margaret had said, setting down her pen at last and looking up at him with the whole of her plain, steady, unhidden heart in her face, "sounds like precisely the sort of arrangement I would be glad to agree to, Your Grace." "Julian," he had corrected her, crossing the room to take her hand. "Julian," she had said, and the word had sounded in her mouth like a vow already spoken. It was, I think, the truest exchange of the whole affair. No ballroom, no assembled trustees, no cousins scheming in the wings, only 2 people who had each spent years believing themselves unwanted, discovering over an ordinary ledger that they had been chosen after all. I have told this story many times since, to friends who ask how the coldest duke in England came to be the warmest husband any of us had witnessed, and I tell it always the same way, that the pretense a desperate man invents to save himself is sometimes, if he is fortunate and honest, and has the great good sense to fall in love with exactly the right person, the very thing that saves him in earnest, and gives him a life he had long ago stopped believing he deserved.